Welcome back, everyone, to the Canadian Baseball Network podcast. I'm Matt Betts, joined today by the radio voice of the Toronto Blue Jays, Ben Shulman. Ben, how's it going?
Going great. As of recording this, I'm still in the Florida weather and not the Toronto weather, so it's fantastic right now.
Are broadcasters like players in that sense, where you get to the point in spring training where it's like, we just got to get this thing rolling, let's get to the real stuff?
Yeah, weather aside, I wouldn't mind. I mean, we're recording this, with only about 2-3 days left in spring. It's about the time where we've done enough games with mass substitutions and all that. It's kind of time to get going, I think, on regular games. And honestly, all the players, except for the starters, feel that way. At the same time, spring is awesome. It's one of my favorite parts of the year. It's just in that last week or so, I think everyone gets a little antsy to do it for real because the shine of baseball has worn off a little bit, of just having baseball back. And now you want real baseball, to be honest. This is kind of fantasy camp baseball, and you want actual competitive games that matter.
Yeah, you don't want to be looking down at your roster sheet on who's number 89 is filling in right field in the seventh inning. I'm sure you're tired of those.
Oh yeah, it's been easier this year, at least I'll say, because of the WBC, and I did enjoy this. We got to see more of the system, I would say, than maybe ever before. So now it's like, often I would have to take a while to memorize numbers, but now it's like, oh, that's Eddie Micheletti Jr. out there. I've watched him play 10 times this spring or something like that. So it's been a little easier this spring. Maybe it's just because it's my third year and some of these guys are year over year guys also. I'm not sure, but it is still almost a daily occurrence where one person that's not supposed to come in according to the pregame plan ends up coming in, and then all of a sudden you got to figure out who that guy is and hopefully find out something that's interesting to say about them, because I want to be conscious. With a lot of these guys playing in Major League spring training games, some of them will never make the big leagues. So I want to make sure that I'm like showcasing who they are, and their family and friends are probably watching or listening to, and I want to give them the credit they deserve for being able to make it into a Major League spring training game.
Well, I do want to talk about the Jays. Obviously, we're talking to the voice of the radio, the Jays on radio. But I want to talk a little bit about you and your kind of broadcasting history. And so can you guys kind of start? How did you first get into broadcasting? When did you realize you wanted to do it? Obviously, your dad as a longtime broadcaster. But tell me a little bit about your story and how you kind of first got into the field.
Yeah, it starts the way I think a lot of people would guess. I mean, I first found out about this as a job in general because of my dad. He was already pretty well established when I was growing up. My two older brothers probably watched him a little bit get established. When my oldest brother was born, he was not doing play-by-play yet at that point. But by the time I kind of became conscious, he was fairly established at that point. And it just started with, he's on the road a lot, especially when I was a kid. He was doing he was doing baseball, but then he was also doing NBA and college basketball. So just college basketball at this point. So when he wasn't there, and it was, we had just had dinner or whatever, my mom and my brothers sometimes would go into, the TV room and turn it on and watch the game that he was doing. And it started that way. And then I felt like because of that, I was paying attention to him as much as I was the athletes in that sport. And that kind of translated to me, at least, into paying a little bit more attention when I was watching games of anyone to the call and how they were sounding. And I don't remember the exact moment, but I would say somewhere around 8 years old, probably, the first idea of wanting to do this came into my head. I actually, when I was a kid, I played on, before you were old enough to play rep, I played on a very good select hockey team, but I was like definitely one of the worst players. So it was clear that being a professional athlete, I got a good taste early of like all those guys went AAA immediately. I was clearly not as good as them, as mostly a single A hockey player my whole life. I was probably a little better at baseball, but clearly was not going to play sports pro. So then broadcasting is what I want to do. And it was, for the most part, it was just an idea. Until I was about 14 or 15, I never actually called anything. I had certain experiences. I would go meet my dad on the road, and, I'd sit in the booth when he was there. If it was just me and him and he was working a game on a trip, then I kind of had to sit in the booth because I couldn't be in the stands alone. Or I sat in a couple production trucks as a kid just to see how it worked. And because he knew I wanted to do that, he, without really telling me at the time, thought that it would be a good foundational thing for me to understand it. But really, until I got into high school, essentially, I had not called or worked on broadcast in any way.
Is there one memory, as you mentioned sitting in a booth, but is there certain memories that kind of stick out to you that kind of are foundational and you look back and like, this is pretty cool now that I'm doing it for the Blue Jays?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when he worked Sunday Night Baseball, when you're a kid, sometimes you understand part of it, but you don't fully understand, the magnitude of like, hey, I'm going on the road and we're going to have dinner with, Oral Hershiser, let's say, or he worked with Bobby Valentine during that time, or, Terry Francona and Tito was, there's a time when I was a kid where I'm on the road and Tito, who really was only doing kind of like a 1-year stop in the broadcast booth, always coaching and managing on his mind, like took me out. We were in New York and he heard that I was a first baseman and he was a first baseman and like helped me with footwork and all that kind of stuff. And that at that point, I kind of knew that was cool because I knew how cool that was because I had watched the Red Sox growing up, obviously play against the Blue Jays and how he had reversed the curse and then won again in 2007. But those kinds of things were so incredible in hindsight. I remember one game I sat in the booth with him, and I think this was when he had gotten to Sunday night already. They were in Chicago at Wrigley Field, and that was the first time I ever saw Aroldis Chapman because he was pitching for not the Cubs yet. He was pitching for the Reds against them. I actually saw him blow a save, which was pretty rare at that point in time. But so a couple of different things stick out to me for sure. I mean, in a kind of foreshadowing moment too, and then I'll end this run-on answer. I went to he used to call Big East basketball a lot also. And when ESPN had the rights to that, and I went to the Big East tournament and Syracuse plays this marathon gajillion overtime game against UConn. And I was so young, we left at halftime, but at the time I did not know, that I would end up going to Syracuse and talking about guys like Eric Devendorf, who thought he hit a game winner there and jumped on the scorer's table at the end of regulation, only for them to call it off on review and send them into overtime. But that ended up being, a really cool one to look back on too.
Yeah, speaking of Syracuse, you obviously went there. That's a very prestigious, broadcasting media school. Can you talk a little bit about your experience there and kind of what you really took away from the educational side of broadcasting?
Sure. Yeah, Syracuse was an incredible experience. I had done some small things before then. I worked at Rogers TV Richmond Hill station that I don't believe is still standing, unfortunately, and called games for the Barry Bay Cats. But that was all formative, foundational stuff. Once I got to Syracuse, it turned a lot more professional, I would say. I didn't know much about it. I knew more about it in concept than what was actually going to be the experience. But the great thing about Syracuse is just incredible facilities, incredible, mentors, both the people who are there teaching and helping out at those facilities and alumni. And then the alumni is so helpful also when you get beyond Syracuse and get out of school there. But the big things at Syracuse, there's an NPR station there, WAER. I called tons and tons of games, did sportscasts there where I would, it's like sports on the ones or whatever for this NPR station. I think it was on the fives actually. And I would come in at, do the 5:35 in the morning. Like, here's what the Knicks did last night. I was very New York focused because I was in Syracuse. So here's what the Mets did and whatever it might be. But also, like, they gave us access. They let us do a lot of that work. And then I had access to some incredible experiences. A colleague of mine, Jaron May, and I, a friend of mine in school, but also we got to go do the Battle for Atlantis in the Bahamas, where the Syracuse men's and women's basketball team was. We had opportunity to go to Super Bowl Media Week when the Bengals took on the Los Angeles Rams in Los Angeles, which was pretty sweet. So there's just an incredible access, I think, there, both in the investment in facilities and then experiences they have for people. It's a little bit cutthroat, in a way. Not students who are competing with each other are nice to each other, and there's a big culture there of feedback, but it's a competitive place to be. And I really enjoyed that. I felt like I had to, bust my butt essentially and work overtime. And, it wasn't like every Thursday to Saturday, or some people Tuesday to Saturday, I could go out to the bar every night. Like, I had to do things to make sure that I could get ahead of other people, not in a doing anything negative to impact them, but everyone was kind of pushing each other. And it felt like it created an environment where everyone expected a lot out of themselves. So that the feeling I have of working there is still in my head. And they often told us there, like, don't always expect it to be like this when you leave. All you guys are pushing each other in ways that sometimes it's great. You find the environment that works like that. But there are a lot of places where you have to like scale back a little bit because you don't want people to get rubbed the wrong way by stuff you're doing.
You mentioned the Barrie Bay Cats, and I have to stop and talk about them a little bit. I played in the IBL for 7 years. When did you start doing? When did you did 2 years there? What years were those?
It would have been the summer of 2017 and the summer of 2018 and the summer of 2019.
I played the year 2018 and coached 2019 in the league, so I apologize for that, first of all.
No, that's okay. I was like a young kid trying to make sure my soundboard worked. If I could get down to the field after all the, without forgetting equipment or spilling coffee on it, that was like a big success of the day.
How important is not necessarily that experience specifically, but an experience like that, kind of away from the bright lights and kind of just working on your craft at that level? How important was that in the evolution of your career?
So important. I mean, everything that I do baseball broadcast wise goes back to my time in Barrie. I had never called a baseball game other than like pretending to watching a TV before then. And Barrie gave me, the resources, the opportunity and the freedom to go out there and call a bunch of games and, make mistakes and get better. And people were super welcoming to me, guys who have played for a long time. And, I didn't really know what I was doing a lot of the time, or I probably went down and asked a lot of dumb questions if I made it down to the field at that point. And, there were nights I probably, kicked the power bar out of the outlet and had to reset the broadcast in the middle of the fifth inning. And, it was great. I think there's no substitute for calling games. There's a lot of theoretical things you can do and listen to and look at to try and get better at broadcasting, but you really just have to at some point step in there and make mistakes and get comfortable doing it. And I still really cherish my time at what was Coates Stadium then, and often with the way we had the broadcast set up, I could see at that point in time the league's grown so much since even that time. Some nights I had 20 people listening to me, but you could tell that they were families of people and there was comments and they would be, getting excited. And it was fun. It felt like a very personal experience too. And it was cool to be a part of that community for 2 summers.
So fast forward to getting the job as the Blue Jays radio guy. When you heard that you had got that job, what was that like? Was there sort of a moment there where it's like, oh, this is really cool? Like, did you ever take time to kind of really enjoy it on a personal level?
Yeah, it's funny. So the way it happens is in 2022, I'm mostly calling games for the High A Fort Wayne Tin Caps, which are a Padres affiliate, and kind of out of nowhere, I had sent some tape over to some of the bosses who are involved in the radio and Sportsnet in general, and somewhat out of nowhere, I was not expecting it. After sending over things back and forth for a while, they just said, "Hey, we need someone to do this Angels series," and got to do a Blue Jays Angels series where they swept the Angels in 4 games, and then I believe Vlad homered off Ohtani in that series, which was pretty cool, and then got to do a little more work late in that year, but still wasn't that integrated. And then felt like really like I got involved in 2023. That's when I would have done pre and post for about 50, 60 games and called 30 games. Filling in for Ben Wagner at that point. But the real moment I feel like was before 2024, when I found out that I was doing it full time. I got the call while I was in an airport connecting. And I'm wary of, especially these days, like getting too emotional in any way in an airport. I feel like people get a little spooked by stuff like that. So I had to contain a lot of it, but it was cool. I happened to be there with my girlfriend who was there with me. So we got to celebrate, a little bit and then really, get to kind of let the emotions out a little bit more once we got back. But it was incredible. I mean, it's still surreal to me, to be honest. Every time I step on the field, every time I go in that clubhouse, pretty much every time there's, a big moment in a game or a game starts, it's still, is a crazy thing in my mind that I get to do this, and it has not worn off yet. I don't think it will for a while, to be honest.
What goes into calling a big league game? Sometimes you get a shot behind the scenes of like the notes that a broadcaster has, but how much? Kind of take me through your day in calling, say next Friday for the home opener. What does your day look like?
Sure. A typical day, let's say it's a 7 o'clock start. You are probably going to get to the ballpark around 2:30, somewhere between 2:30 and 3, because most likely on most days the clubhouse is going to open about 4 hours before the game. So it depends on different people, but for me, I'll get there at around 2:30, 2:45. Lineup's not out yet, so there's not a lot of specific stuff I can do, and I've probably earlier in the day, I've who the starters are, so I've already done a little bit of work, hopefully on what the starter's bringing, if it's in the middle of the season at all, what they've looked like recently. Probably talk to some people in the lead up about that starter. But get in 2:33, go to the clubhouse. It's about an hour. Once the clubhouse wraps up, go into the manager's office. John Schneider talks for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes with the assembled media, local writers, often some away writers will dip in there as well. Then it's kind of like a choose your own path thing. For me, often, if there's someone I have not gotten to talk to yet that I wanted to that day, let's say they had a meeting or they were getting treatment in clubhouse, go out to the field, batting practice is just starting. There's opportunity to pull guys for conversations there, see what people are working on. You can gain insight sometimes. Not necessarily like eavesdropping, but if things are loudly being done in front of you, you might have an idea of like, hey, they've hit 10 ground balls to the backhand side of Santiago Espinal. He's working on that play right now or something like that. And so get a feel for that. At some point, you got to go upstairs, eat, which is probably around about 5:15-ish, fill out your scorebook. You're going to get a lot of notes. And I will say that's the difference between the majors and the minors. In the minors, it's almost the reverse in what your work is doing. You are trying to be the reporter. You're trying to get all the information. And there's challenges that come with that, but there's also cool parts of that. In major league games, you get sent, I probably get sent 7 or 8 different packages a day of different information. And frankly, I'm very grateful to get all the information. I use different ones each day, but on a daily basis, it's way too much. Like, there's no way if I crammed all that information into a game, you would fall asleep. There's just way too much to all use on a given day. So it's about sifting through what stories do I have and how am I going to link that to information. When I use numbers, at least, especially once I'm given there, all I'm trying to do essentially is provide proof for what I'm saying, because I didn't play in the big leagues. And so I shouldn't necessarily have a track record to speak on things without providing some data behind it, almost like a lawyer arguing a case. So sift through all of that once I've filled out my lineup card. Chris and I have probably gone over the open of how we're going to start our broadcast, not to mention with our producer. We often have some clips that we might play off the top of the broadcast to focus. Definitely hit the restroom before we get going, and then stand up for anthems and get ready to go. So it's a pretty standard daily routine. Very rarely does it change. Sundays are a little bit sleepier, a little bit less activity on a Sunday, but almost every day of the year, that's pretty much what the schedule is.
What are the biggest differences and what adjustments do you have to make when you're calling a game live in person versus in the studio when it's an away game?
It's not a huge adjustment. I mean, you just kind of bank some information. I think in terms of, anecdotal stories and stuff like that, I want to make sure that when I'm going down to the clubhouse or the field, and this is true even if it's like a long homestand, not everything, because I'm not a writer that's filing, not everything I get has to be used that day. So if something piques my interest or if I think it might help me down the road, go up, get some extra stories, have some stuff prepared. And then when you're not there in the ballpark, just, often give yourself a little bit of a half beat. You obviously don't have the same visual, capacity. So, whereas I'm pretty hard on myself if I'm late on something, if I'm a little bit behind the pop of the glove or the crack of the bat live, I would say, it's almost dangerous to play right on the line when you can't see everything because you might find yourself guessing. So if you can just play a little bit, like a half beat behind it while still being on the play, that's going to be the biggest thing, I think.
Do you have a most memorable call? I'm guessing it might be from last year's playoff run. I don't know, but
yeah, I would say probably it's George Springer's home run to send them to the World Series. The first batter I ever called for the Blue Jays in 2022 was George Springer, who also hit a leadoff homer that game. That one sticks with me, even though I kind of messed up the call, but it's okay. What else? A weird one, but it always sticks with me. It's one of the most fun games that I've done. In 2024, the Blue Jays had a 14-inning game in the middle of the year after they were clearly kind of already out of it against the Pittsburgh Pirates, and Davis Schneider hit a walk-off homer the opposite way, and he was having a bit of a tough year. I think this is true. No one's ever acknowledged it, but they play like "Hey Baby" at Rogers Center now every game. If I'm not mistaken, in the middle of like the 12th inning, people just broke out into that song in the game, and that was not a packed ballpark, so that game was just a crazy game that sticks with me a lot. But if I have to give one answer, I would say it's Springer homers off Bizardo to eventually send them to the World Series. Someone did remind me recently, it was not a lock that they were going to win that game after he hit the homer, but in the building, it kind of like when Bautista homered, it was in the 7th. It wasn't necessarily a lock, but you kind of felt like once that happened, that was their game and it was done.
Yeah, I feel like that's how everyone's going to remember it. Like that home run sent them to the World Series. Like no one remembers what happened after that because it ended up working out. But I do want to talk a little bit about the influence of your dad. Does he give you? How much do you guys talk about broadcasting now that you're both doing it for the same team? Is there any advice that he's ever given you that kind of stuck with you?
Yeah, we talk about it a little bit, but just because of the mechanics of him calling games while I'm calling games, he doesn't actually necessarily hear a ton of my calls. He might hear the highlights, but I know both of us would feel like only listening to the highlights doesn't fully often sums up only very little of what someone's doing. So frankly, I would say the majority of if he ever says anything to me is if there's like an Apple game and he'll go on Apple and toggle it to have our radio broadcast be synced up there. That's when, he might give one or two things, but both of us, often people come up to me and say we sound alike, which is flattering. I'm happy to sound like him. I think he's fantastic at it. But I think consciously, especially when I was younger, tried not to have too much of the back and forth. Probably just for like keeping our family relationship better. I'm sure some people can manage it, but it's probably a little easier not to have that. And then B, so we didn't want to make it sound like I sounded just like him, because there's certain things, like sometimes he tells me something and he'll be like, this is a subjective one. And, like, this is how I do it. And sometimes I disagree. And I want, the ability to kind of do it a little bit differently. So he gives me some feedback, not a ton. But I have a couple other places that I would go for it. But the biggest piece of advice that he probably gave to me before I ever called any game, which is the same advice that Buck gave to him after like the second or third game he ever called for the Blue Jays, is if you can make it sound like it's two guys sitting at a bar, then you're doing a pretty good job. And so that's, I want to do such a good job that sometimes I find myself overdoing it. And then that's a nice cue to remind myself, I think, to like scale it back, relax. It's baseball, have fun with it. You can mess around a little bit. I think, especially on the radio, not every game in the middle of June has to be so serious. Talk like you would talk with your friends in the middle of the game.
What did you learn from Buck being around him for the last few years? And obviously such an icon in Blue Jays history, but talk a little bit about your relationship with him and some of your experiences.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, such a big force in my life in terms of calling games. By the time I was, even in elementary school, my dad wasn't calling Blue Jays games. So I listened to more Buck calling the Blue Jays by far, I would say. And, such an incredible career. Congratulations to him, first and foremost. He was really helpful, and I think I wouldn't have blamed him for not wanting to or not having the time, let's say, to, give me pointers and help me out. At the end of the day, I'm only filling in on a handful of TV games with him specifically if I'm doing 20, 25, 30 a year. But he was always, offering advice and doing it in a good way. Really made me feel like I belonged there, kind of in a big way. And one of the biggest things he taught me, honestly, and probably should have been apparent, but he's such a legend of what he does, has seen so much of the game, and has is so smart with it. He could probably get away with just kind of like show and going if he wanted to. He could show up, go to the booth, not do anything. He'd be fine. But he showed me, how hard someone can work still at that stature. Like if he's going to be there early, if he's going to be buzzing around and talking to everyone, if he's constantly going to be looking for new angles and new stories, he loved to say, something that Jack Morris said to him, but I'll censor slightly. Like, what are you going to ask me today that other people aren't going to ask me? That was a big thing from him. Like a lot of guys get repeat questions all the time. He would say as a player too, that a lot of people come up, ask me the same question, get something that other people aren't getting. And so I just the effort and time and care that he put into it, it's unmatched, and it shows in his broadcast. But at the same time, it was still surprising at first to see just how, above and beyond he went in his preparation and his reporting before a game to make sure he had everything for the game.
I do want to talk about the Blue Jays, but I do have one more question. You're also a basketball fan. You called a lot of basketball. What's the difference? How do you adjust from calling a game at the pace of baseball to a game at the pace of basketball?
Yeah, it's different. And primarily these days I call basketball on TV, whereas primarily I call baseball on the radio. I think, for me, basketball, like when I'm doing baseball, let's say, and this is something that Dan Duva, who broadcasts for the Vegas Golden Knights, he was my boss in the Cape Cod Baseball League, and he almost saw baseball as kind of like a rocking chair. You rock forward with each pitch, and you want to get, and literally I will rock sometimes because I'm not conscious of what I'm doing when I'm calling a game that much, but you rock forward and your tone goes up with each pitch, and then you kind of rock back in between pitches and calm down a little bit and do that for the most part again and again and get into that kind of rhythm. Basketball, like you're getting like shook the whole time, basically. Like someone is just grabbing you. And it's, especially these days, I feel like basketball is so high paced these days. Maybe there would have been less of a difference back then, but you really, I think, want to make sure that you're providing that kind of energy. I think people watch baseball, not that there isn't a ton of excitement, and especially in the postseason, tons of excitement. But people turn it on in the summer. They're sitting on their deck. It's a relaxing thing. When you turn on basketball in the middle of the winter, like you're not watching it to relax. You want to get pumped up and you want to get fired up. And so I think you tap into, just even more energy. And if you're, if it's a sleepy Sunday for you, you can kind of play that in baseball a little bit, but you can't really play that in basketball. You should be ready to go because a guy might, fly in from 6 feet away and dunk right on someone's face. So in some ways, the mechanics are the same, but I think the energy of the two sports, you have to kind of channel that into your call because they're two very different sports. And some people are fans of both, but I think a lot of hardcore fans of one feel different about watching it than hardcore fans of the other.
Okay, let's get to the Jays now. We're now days away from opening day. What have been your biggest takeaways from spring training this year?
I think they have a really exciting rotation. I think Dylan Cease has looked great. Cody Ponce, I just, called, I think his last start. Yeah, if that checks out. His last start of the spring. He's going to end spring with like 2/3 of a run as his ERA. His stuff is outrageous. So I think you're looking at a starting rotation. Yes, there are some injuries to start the year, unfortunately. Found out recently about Trey Savage starting the year behind, and Jose Barrios, obviously, with the stress fracture, not to mention Shane Bieber. But I think you have a big staff with big stuff coming in. And then I think you're looking at, a team that's incredibly confident. I think there were a lot of questions coming off last year about what the team was. And I think this team now, not in overconfidence, but, like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. has a fantastic postseason. And he just goes to the WBC and rakes. And really, I think all of us were expecting him to. It wasn't even that much of a shock. Not that he's cleared any sort of hump because he's had a handful of very, very, very productive seasons already. But it feels like he's in that zone right now. And it's felt like Dalton Varsho is in that kind of zone right now. And Addison Barger is in that kind of zone. And not necessarily the results in spring training, but a bunch of these guys are just smacking the ball all over the field. So I think it's a team that knows what it had to do to get there last year, returns mostly the same guys. And then if it's not those guys, you bring in a Kazuma Okamoto. He played for essentially the New York Yankees equivalent in NPB and the Yomiuri Giants, and played at the highest pressure position there as third baseman. They got a lot of winners now. And a lot of these guys, when you're on a team that goes to the World Series, you are a winner in a way because you were on that team that won so much to get there. So I just think it's a team that really understands what they have to do, saw what they did last year. Not that they fully replicated. You got to change some stuff, but are trying to channel some of that and then add some stuff to it to get back there.
This is going to sound ridiculous. I'm going to say it anyways, but is this the year you talked about Vladdy? Is this the year that we really see Vladdy put it all together, so to speak? You saw the great postseason run. You saw the greatness at the World Baseball Classic. And when I say put it all together, I mean over the length of the season, 150, 155 games. You really see that maybe 40 home run, 120 RBI guy.
It's possible. I mean, I've always thought, I know he hit the 48 in 2021. To me, if you look, and I know it wasn't the most exciting season for the team, if you look at the 2024 season, to me, that might be like optimum Vladdy in a way. I think, could he go out there and hit 40 home runs? I think that's possible. He's got tons and tons of power. But I think the best Vladdy and the most consistent one is more of the line drive hitter who hits liners over the wall. And so do you get like a 310, 310, 33, 35 homer Vlad, a bunch of RBIs, that I think is very possible. He just torched some of the best pitching in baseball last year for a month span. And, it was an odd regular season, no doubt, from him, but I do think that he's in a spot right now. He just turned 27, which is, amazing to believe how long we've known him now as a major league player. You could argue he's just getting into his prime right now. And so I do think there's a chance. And I think however much you value them, a lot of the projection systems would say that Vlad's got a good chance to win a batting title this year. He's got a good chance to be like a 30 double or 40 double, 30 homer kind of guy. And I think just that anchor in the middle of the lineup. Could he hit 40 homers? No doubt. But I do think that there's a good chance that whether it's 2024 or 2021, that we see one of the biggest years of Vladdy's career come right now, because I think he's locked in with the team. He's had some ups and downs in his career. It feels like he's kind of got himself into the spot he needs to be right now to have a lot of success.
What's the concern level on the ground around Trey Savage and his health?
It's not super high, I would say, right now. I mean, and that's on, for some inside baseball, that's on Friday, March 20th. I went on the air the morning before they announced it. I didn't think that was happening at that point in time. And so I was like, it'll probably be fine. 3 hours later, I was very wrong. So it could change. But based on the information we have, shoulder impingement, working with Chris LaRue, talked to him a little bit about an impingement. That in itself, not a huge injury. It's essentially limiting your range of motion a little bit. And who knows, if they didn't have other qualified and capable starters right now, if he wasn't, coming off a huge innings workload boost in the longest year of his life, maybe there's, more wiggle room for him to start the year going. But I think what you're looking at with the information we know right now is he's a couple weeks delayed. Obviously, that's not ideal. Like, I wouldn't sell that as a good thing, but I also wouldn't say that it's like DEFCON 1 and it's, raise all the alarm bells, because a shoulder impingement, as long as it doesn't get worse, and he's already been throwing since then, it seems like it was something he entered camp with and they just couldn't get him ready in time. It's not, if they said elbow inflammation, I'm a little more concerned, to be honest. So we'll see what happens. I mean, shoulder injuries can be serious, but right now it does seem to be relatively minor.
Before we let you run, I want you to share, give me one storyline this season that you're watching that maybe other people aren't, or isn't, dominating the headlines.
I do. I mean, this isn't the sexiest one, but I'm a sucker for funky arm angle guys, and the Jays have heavily dove back into that market. I mean, not just Tyler Rogers. I think Chase Lee pitches a lot for them this year, and I think maybe not a true side armor, but I think Joe Mantiply, veteran lefty, probably factors in at some point this year. They threw, I think, 8 different lefties out of their pen at some point last year. So I think that's one that I'm looking at. I guess another one that would be slightly under the radar, though he got some more shine when people were at the WBC. He's not going to break with the team. I'm not sure his role is going to be huge with the team this year, but it seems like catcher Brandon Valenzuela is on the precipice of being a very nice major league player. And I think the Blue Jays are happy with their catching room right now. I think Alejandro Kirk and Tyler Heineman combined, they were one of the most productive catching rooms in all of baseball last year, if not the most productive. But they will hit the IL at some point this year. I hope they don't. Knock on wood, they don't. I'm not wishing it on them, but they're catchers. One of them will end up on the IL. And I'll be interested to see how Valenzuela handles that. If he's the first guy up, he'll be in a competition with CJ Stubbs, I think, to get that call up, and then see what maybe a year or 2 years or 3 years down the line, another Blue Jays catcher could look like, likely paired beside Alejandro Kirk, who's obviously been extended for the foreseeable future.
I love it. Middle relievers and backup catchers.
Oh yeah, I'm kind of a sicko, to be honest. That's like, there's a lot. I love the talk of the All-Stars and the Gold Glovers and Silver Sluggers, but we're at the point in camp where who's a fringe guy, and it means a lot for them. It's the stakes are a lot higher, good year or bad year, for some of the guys on the fringes than the guys who already have their deals.
Absolutely. And as we said, the season is just days away and it can't come soon enough. Ben, we're really looking forward to listening to you all summer long, and we appreciate you taking the time this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.